Okay, let's dive in. We're starting this deep dive with something pretty staggering, a fact that honestly challenges a lot of assumptions about how political change happens today.
Go on.
Right, so get this. A government, an entrenched establishment, basically overthrown in September 2025. And not through the usual channels, no military coup, no sort of old school revolutionaries handing out pamphlets.
Okay, so how?
This is the wild part. It was driven by a digitally native generation. We're talking Discord servers, viral memes, and maybe most iconically, an anime pirate flag, all in about 48 hours for the main event.
Wow. Okay, that does sound less like geopolitics and more like, well, something else entirely. But you're saying this is the real story of Nepal's Gen Z revolution.
That's exactly what our sources are detailing. It was explosive, it seemed completely leaderless from the outside, and it was incredibly effective. So much so that analysts are already calling it a major turning
I've
point.
seen some of those terms floating around, things like the Asian Spring, or maybe more fittingly, the first digital spring.
Precisely. That's the framing. It suggests this wasn't just a one-off event in Nepal, but maybe the start of a whole new kind of global political wave driven by Gen Z using digital tools.
Okay, that's a huge claim. The start of a new kind of spring.
It is. And our sources today really dig into how it happened. We'll cover that incredible 48-hour period, of course. But honestly, the really fascinating part for this deep dive is what came after. This wasn't just about tearing down. This movement arrived with a surprisingly detailed policy blueprint
A blueprint for what exactly?
for genuine economic renewal in a developing nation. And crucially, it's a model that, if it works, directly challenges a lot of the anti-immigration politics we're seeing dominate in the West right now.
Ah, okay. So the implications are potentially massive, well beyond Nepal itself.
Exactly. That's our mission here today, really. For you listening, we want to tackle two big questions. First, what were the underlying problems? What pushed Nepal's youth, who had endured so much already, past that breaking point? It wasn't just about a social media ban, right? There had to be deeper structural issues.
Yeah, the trigger is rarely the whole story. You need that dry tinder for the spark to catch.
Right. And the second question is the how. How on earth did they organize this? How do you coordinate thousands of people to storm major government buildings, essentially leaderlessly, using decentralized digital tools? That organizational model, that's the piece that seems to have really gone viral globally.
Okay, let's unpack it. Where do we start? The spark itself.
Yeah, let's start with that immediate catalyst. Governments, especially those feeling a bit shaky, they usually know there are certain lines you just don't cross. Third rails, right?
Mm.
Yet, in early September 2025, the Nepalese government seems to have grabbed the biggest digital third rail imaginable. What exactly did they do on September 4th?
September 4th, 2025. That's the date it all ignited. The government suddenly, and quite abruptly, announced a sweeping ban on access to 26 major social media and communication platforms.
26. That
Okay.
sounds comprehensive.
Oh, it was. Think about the pillars of online life. Facebook, gone. X, formerly Twitter, gone. TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, even LinkedIn. Basically, the primary ways people, especially young people, connect, share information, find jobs, and, crucially, voice dissent.
So for a generation that lives much of its life online, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was like cutting off oxygen.
That's a good way to put it. Digital strangulation. It hit everything: social lives, professional networking, political organization, access to news outside state channels. It was a massive overreach.
What was the spin? Governments never just say, we're censoring you. What was the official story?
They tried to dress it up, quite thinly, as a fiscal measure. They announced a new digital services tax targeting these foreign tech platforms, claiming it was about asserting Nepal's fiscal sovereignty, making big tech pay their share.
But nobody believed that was the real reason.
Not for a second. The timing, the scale. It was transparently cynical. Everyone, particularly the youth who make up a huge demographic chunk in Nepal, immediately saw it for what it likely was: a desperate move by a politically entrenched, increasingly corrupt elite to shut down criticism.
Criticism about what specifically? What were people complaining about online that the government wanted silenced?
Primarily, frustration over systemic corruption, lack of opportunities, and the stark inequality that's becoming more and more visible because of social media. They were trying to turn off the platform that was broadcasting their failures. Instead, well, They lit the fuse.
Okay, so the government tries to pull the plug. What happens next? How does a population fight back when its main communication channels are blocked?
The reaction was fascinating and incredibly fast. It showed a level of digital literacy and, frankly, defiance that the government clearly underestimated.
The first steps.
First, bypass the ban. VPN downloads virtual private networks that mask your location and encrypt traffic went through the roof. We're talking a reported 300% surge almost overnight. People just refused to be cut off.
So they found a technical workaround pretty quickly.
Instantly.
Yeah.
But it went beyond just getting back online. The censorship attempt actually acted as an organizing catalyst. This is where a group called Nepal comes in.
Nepal. Had they been active before?
Yes, they were an existing civil society group advocating for good governance and transparency, but maybe not a household name across the entire country. Overnight, though, they transformed. They became the impromptu digital nerve center for the entire resistance movement.
A digital nerve center. So not a physical HQ with people meeting in secret, but an online hub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Totally decentralized. Our sources indicate they were coordinating upwards of 100,000 active members within days, and they were using platforms that young people already dominated.
Which ones?
Primarily Discord, which is huge in gaming communities, but great for organizing large groups into channels. Also Telegram, known for its security features. And, interestingly, they leveraged existing private gaming chats. Spaces not designed for politics at all became conduits for real-time coordination and information sharing.
So using the tools of global digital culture against the local state attempting to censor them.
Precisely. One activist was quoted calling Discord Parliament 2.0. The idea was that the free flow of information, even routed through VPNs and gaming chats, became their weapon, their bullets of truth, as this activist put it.
It's an incredible display of adaptive organization. But like we said, this level of fury, this willingness to mobilize so quickly, it doesn't just come from a Wi-Fi outage, however widespread. This must have tapped into something much deeper, right? Some pre-existing conditions.
Absolutely. The social media ban was a spark, but the powder keg had been filling for years.
Yeah.
You can really point to three major interconnected structural problems that had pushed Nepalese youth to the brink.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is fundamental, economic precarity, particularly among the educated youth. Nepal had actually invested significantly in education over the years. Literacy rates were up. College attendance was relatively high.
So you have a generation with qualifications, with ambitions.
Exactly. But then they graduate and thun it. Youth unemployment was reportedly over 20%. 20% of these educated young people couldn't find meaningful work in their own country. That creates this massive pool of frustration, disillusionment, and frankly, potential energy for radical change.
It's that classic dynamic, isn't it? The educated but blotched generation. We've seen that fuel unrest historically.
It's a powerful force, and it connects directly to the second major issue, which is perhaps the most emotionally charged: Nepal's extreme remittance dependency.
Right. You mentioned this earlier. The statistic is huge, something like a third of the entire GDP.
Yeah, around 33%. Think about that. 1/3 of the national economy relies on money sent home by Nepalese working abroad, often in grueling conditions in the Gulf states, Malaysia, or elsewhere. This created what analysts have starkly called the economy of absence.
The economy of absence. That phrase really leans. Can you unpack what that feels like, the human cost behind that statistic?
It means that for a huge segment of the population, daily life is defined by separation. It means kids growing up knowing their parents mostly through crackly phone calls or video chats, their connection measured in money transfers. It means entire communities are hollowed out, kept afloat financially, yes, but losing their most dynamic, productive people.
So success for many young Nepalese meant leaving.
That was the structural reality they were rebelling against. Success meant exile. It meant building a life somewhere else while your family and community remained behind. Gen Z wasn't just angry about being unemployed. They were furious at a system where the only path to a decent life forced them to abandon their home. Their demand wasn't just for jobs, it was for the right to build a future in Nepal.
That adds a whole different layer of emotional intensity to the protests. It's about reclaiming the right to belong, not just economic opportunity.
Completely. And then there's the third factor, which acted like pouring salt on these wounds.
Yeah.
Visible inequality, amplified by social media itself.
Ah, the irony. The very platforms the government tried to ban were showcasing the problem.
Exactly. Before the ban, platforms like Instagram and TikTok were, awash with viral content showing the lifestyles of the elite, particularly the children of the political and business aristocracy. the so-called Nepo babies.
Flaunting wealth.
Oh yeah, we're talking luxury cars, designer watches, lavish holidays in places like Dubai or Europe, constant, in-your-face displays of wealth. Now, contrast that with the national average annual income in Nepal at the time, which was around 1,400 US dollars.
$1,400 a year. The gap is obscene.
It's vast.
Yeah.
And social media made that gap viscerally, undeniably real for everyone. Every single day. It wasn't just abstract knowledge, it was a daily feed of injustice. So when the government moved to shut down those platforms, it wasn't just seen as censorship, it felt like the elite trying to hide the evidence of their own excess and corruption from the very people suffering because of it.
So you have economic despair, the trauma of forced migration, and this glaring digitally amplified inequality. That's the context for September 4th.
That's a tinderbox. The social media ban wasn't just a policy mistake, it was an insult added to deep injury, and it finally pushed things over the edge.
Okay, let's walk through the timeline then. The ban happens on the 4th. Digital resistance starts immediately with VPNs and groups like Hami Nepal coordinating. But how did it jump from online outrage to physical confrontations so fast?
The digital organizing translated into street power with remarkable speed. The networks were buzzing, plans were being made, locations shared, all bypassing the official bans. By September 8th, just 4 days after the ban, it exploded into the physical realm.
What happened on the 8th?
Tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly young, converged on key symbolic locations in Kathmandu. Places like Medakar Mandala, a traditional protest site, and the areas around the Parliament building. The scale and speed clearly caught the authorities off guard.
And the government's reaction, was it conciliatory? Did they try to de-escalate?
Quite the opposite. And this was the critical mistake, the moment that turned protest into revolution. The security forces, seemingly unprepared or perhaps just panicking at the sheer numbers, responded with brutal force.
Wow, brutal.
Our sources confirm the use of tear gas, baton charges, and devastatingly, live ammunition fired into crowds in several areas. It was a catastrophic miscalculation.
Live ammunition, that changes everything. Were there casualties?
Yes. Tragically, 19 people were confirmed killed on September 8th alone. Another 347 were reported severely injured. That bloodshed was broadcast almost instantly thanks to those VPNs and back channels. The images went viral within Nepal and started leaking out internationally.
The government shooting its own citizens? That must have galvanized people who were maybe on the fence.
Absolutely. Any ambiguity about the state's intentions evaporated. It became a clear life-or-death struggle. The political fallout was immediate, too. The Home Minister, the person in charge of internal security, resigned that very evening. It was the first major crack in the dam.
A resignation. But the protests didn't stop.
No, the government imposed a national curfew, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The momentum was unstoppable. The violence on the 8th set the stage for the complete collapse the very next day, September 9th.
Okay, September 9th, the day the government effectively fell. What happened?
The catalyst was the resignation of the Prime Minister, K.P. Sharma Oli. Once news of his resignation broke, it was like a signal. The protesters who had been demanding reform shifted their goal. It wasn't about asking anymore. It was about taking control.
Taking control of what?
The symbols and centers of state power. Coordinated groups of protesters moved on and stormed 3 key locations. Singha Darbar, which is the main government administrative complex, like the heart of the bureaucracy, the Supreme Court complex, and Baluwatar, the official residence of the Prime Minister.
They just walked in. Was there resistance?
Reports suggest security forces were overwhelmed, perhaps demoralized after Oli's resignation, or maybe some units even stood down. The protesters breached the gates, occupied the grounds, in some cases entered the buildings themselves. It was a direct, physical dismantling of the government's authority.
And this was coordinated. How? Still through those Discord channels and Telegram groups.
That's what the analysis suggests. Decentralized commands, real-time updates on where security forces were weak, where numbers were needed. It wasn't one person directing traffic, it was the network itself guiding the flow.
Amidst this chaos at the centers of power, something else happened that really speaks to the scale of the state's breakdown. The prison breaches.
Yes. This is one of the most stunning details and highlights just how completely state control vanished in those hours. It wasn't just government buildings. Mobs, seemingly spontaneously organized or perhaps directed by elements within the broader protest network, targeted and breached major prison facilities. Reports confirmed breaches at 3 major prisons in 3 different cities, Kalali, Nakhu, and Kataski. And the result was Well, staggering. An estimated 13,500 prisoners escaped.
13,500.
Yeah.
That's a total breakdown of law and order.
It's utter system collapse. We're talking about potentially dangerous criminals alongside political prisoners, maybe petty offenders, just released en masse into a situation of national chaos. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was bordering on state failure. The authorities reacted by shutting down Kathmandu's Tribhuvan International Airport, likely to prevent key figures from fleeing or further instability.
So by the end of September 9th, the PM has resigned, key buildings are occupied, thousands of prisoners are out. What happens next? Who steps into that vacuum? A leaderless movement just achieved its goal, but how do you govern?
That's the crucial question. And this is where the movement showed a surprising degree of foresight, or perhaps where pre-existing elements of civil society were ready to step in. The protesters themselves, having completely rejected the old political class, needed a figurehead, someone credible to manage a transition.
And they found someone.
Yes, they coalesced around a figure widely respected for her integrity and independence, Sushila Karki. She was Nepal's first female Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, though she was retired at this point. She had a reputation for being incorruptible.
So the protesters essentially nominated her from the streets.
Effectively, yes. Her name emerged from the protest networks as the consensus choice for an interim leader. It was a signal that they wanted institutional stability, but under new, clean leadership. The speed was key. The army chief and the president met with her quickly to legitimize the process and avoid a complete power vacuum or military takeover.
And this became official.
It did, very rapidly. On September 12th, just 3 days after the PM resigned, the existing parliament was formally dissolved. Sushila Karki was sworn in as Nepal's first female interim prime minister.
Wow. From street nomination to interim PM in basically 72 hours.
It was incredibly swift. Her mandate was clear: stabilize the country, oversee a transition, and schedule new elections. Those were set for March 5th, 2026.
What about the human cost? We mentioned 19 dead on the 8th. Did that number rise?
Sadly, yes. As the situation stabilized and information became clearer, the official death toll from the few days of intense conflict eventually reached 75 by September 17th. It was a tragic price. But the new interim government moved quickly to acknowledge this, promising compensation of 1 million Nepalese rupees, that's about $7,000 USD, to the families of those killed. A symbolic but important gesture.
Okay, so a fragile stability emerges under an interim leader. Let's talk about the symbols of this revolution. You mentioned an anime pirate flag. That seems unusual for a political uprising.
It does, doesn't it? But it's pure Gen Z political communication. The dominant symbol wasn't a national figure or a traditional political icon. It was the Jolly Roger flag of the Straw Hat Pirates, from the incredibly popular manga and anime series One Piece.
One Piece, the pirate anime. How did that become the flag of the revolution?
It seems to have been borrowed initially from student protests in Indonesia, another place where One Piece is massively popular. It just resonated perfectly with the Nepalese youth.
Why? What does it symbolize?
Think about the Straw Hat crew in One Piece. They're a diverse group of individuals, fiercely loyal to each other, each pursuing their own dream, united by their captain Luffy, who embodies ultimate freedom. And crucially, they constantly fight against corrupt, tyrannical, established powers, the world government, the Marines, other pirates who abuse their power.
Okay, I can see the parallels. A band of rebels fighting for freedom against a corrupt global order.
Exactly. It's a ready-made metaphor for young people feeling oppressed by an entrenched, greedy elite. It's instantly recognizable across the generation. It carries this inherent anti-authoritarian message, and it has a kind of ironic detachment mixed with genuine aspirational feeling. It's cool, it's defiant, and it's theirs.
So slogans like, "We are the Straw Hats, no one rules us," which were seen spray-painted everywhere, that wasn't just kids being fans.
No, it was a political statement.
Yeah.
It meant we are leaderless in the traditional sense, we are self-governing, we reject your illegitimate authority, and we fight for our own freedom. It bypassed traditional political language entirely and used the language of global pop culture as a unifying banner.
Fascinating. Now let's dig into the mechanics behind this. You called it the Discord Revolution. How did this decentralized, leaderless thing actually work logistically? Political scientists apparently studied this. What did they find?
Yeah, the Institute for Economics and Peace, among others, flagged this as a major case study. They talked about how it exemplified positive peace, emerging rapidly from free information flow, even under censorship. The key was the structure.
Which was deliberately leaderless?
Yes, for strategic reasons. No central leader means no single point of failure. You can't decapitate the movement by arresting one or two key people. It also prevents co-option by established political forces.
But how do you coordinate storming buildings or organizing protests without leaders giving orders? Doesn't decentralization usually just mean chaos?
That's the innovative part. It wasn't chaos, it was structured decentralization. They apparently used AI-assisted tools like bots for some logistical coordination, things like suggesting secure meeting points, maybe disseminating alerts about police movements anonymously. But the core human structure was described by activists using this term. 11-11-11-11-11 networks.
1111, what does that mean?
Think of it as fractal communication. Instead of a pyramid with a leader at the top, imagine small, tight-knit groups, maybe around 11 people, who trust each other implicitly. That's your local action cell. They operate autonomously based on broadly agreed principles.
Okay, a small local group.
Right. Now, each person in that group of 11 is also connected, maybe as the primary contact, to 11 other trusted individuals, potentially in different neighborhoods or groups. Information, plans, requests for support, they spread horizontally through these trusted connections, rather than vertically from a central command.
So information ripples outwards, and actions can be coordinated locally, but informed by the wider network.
Exactly. It's incredibly resilient. If one cell gets compromised or one communication link is broken, the rest of the network continues to function. The information finds other pathways. It's organic, adaptive, and very hard for a centralized state security apparatus to shut down completely. They were essentially fighting a network with a hierarchy, and the network won.
That structure. That sounds like something that could be replicated anywhere the tools exist.
And that's precisely what seems to have happened next.
Right. So this wasn't just contained to Nepal. The success, the symbolism, the very method of this decentralized, digitally fueled revolution it spread. This is where the term the first digital spring really takes hold.
Yes, the digital DNA of the Nepal uprising proved highly contagious. Analysts tracking subsequent protest movements across different continents started noticing striking similarities, a shared pattern.
What were the common threads? What made Nepal's model so instantly translatable, even across vastly different cultures and political contexts?
Analysts pinpointed about 4 key characteristics that kept popping up. First, the demographics were almost identical. The median age of protesters was consistently under 25. These were students, young professionals, gig economy workers, digital creators, basically Gen Z.
A generation that grew up online shares a globalized culture to some extent and feels the weight of inheriting multiple crises, maybe.
Exactly. They share the anxieties about climate change, economic instability, lack of opportunity, and they communicate using a shared digital language. Second, the triggers for these protests were often very similar to Nepal's: attempts at digital censorship, viral revelations of government corruption, or sudden painful tax hikes on essential goods or services, things that directly impact daily life and digital freedom.
Okay, demographics and triggers. What else?
Third, the unifying forces weren't traditional political ideologies, not strictly left versus right in the old sense. Instead, movements were often unified by shared culture, memes, inside jokes, references to anime like One Piece, global music trends. These became the shared vocabulary and rallying points.
Culture as the political glue.
In many ways, yes. And fourth, the core demands, when you distilled them, were remarkably consistent across continents. Demands for government transparency, decent jobs and economic opportunity, action on climate change, and the protection of digital freedoms. Basic stuff, but demanded with a new urgency and using new tools.
So let's trace the ripple effect. Where did the first echoes of Nepal appear? It moved quickly, right? Africa seems to have been first.
Almost immediately. In Madagascar, later in September 2025, protests erupted, adopting the name Gen Z Mada. They were mobilizing against years of frustration over chronic electricity blackouts, rampant government corruption, and deep-seated poverty.
Similar underlying issues to Nepal then. Did it escalate?
It did. The protests became very confrontational. Sadly, reports indicate 22 people were killed and over 100 injured in clashes with security forces. But the pressure was immense. President Andry Rajoelina was eventually forced to dissolve his entire cabinet in an attempt to quell the unrest.
And the Nepal connection, was it just thematic similarity?
No, it was explicit. Eyewitness accounts and photos showed the one-piece straw hat Jolly Roger flag being flown prominently during the protests in Antananarivo, the capital. It was direct, conscious adoption of the symbol that had just succeeded in Nepal.
Wow. So the symbol jumped continents almost instantly, carrying that meaning of successful youth revolt.
Absolutely. It demonstrated the incredible speed of cultural and tactical transmission in the digital age. From Madagascar, the wave seemed to hit North Africa.
Where specifically?
In Morocco, starting around October 2025, a network calling itself Gen Z 212 being Morocco's international dialing code, began organizing protests.
What was their main grievance?
It was centered on government spending priorities. Morocco was investing huge sums of public money in its bid to co-host the 2030 FIFA World Cup. Meanwhile, the country was facing severe, long-standing crises in basic public services like healthcare and education.
So, echoes of the inequality theme in Nepal, lavish spending versus public need.
Precisely. The Gen Z 212 network used digital platforms to highlight this contrast, and again the One Piece symbol appeared alongside a very specific, locally relevant hashtag, #BreadNotStadiums. It perfectly married the global symbol of rebellion with a concrete local economic demand.
That's sophisticated messaging. Using a global meme but grounding it locally. Did it stop there? Africa, North Africa? Did it cross the Atlantic?
It did. The phenomenon wasn't limited by geography. In Peru, also starting around September-October 2025, just weeks after the events in Nepal, existing anti-corruption protests gained new momentum and visibility, particularly in Lima.
What was the context in Peru?
Protesters were demanding the resignation of the then-president Dina Boluarte, citing ongoing political instability and allegations of corruption and human rights abuses. And, yet again, observers reported seeing the Straw Hat Jolly Roger banner being used by young protesters as this now universal symbol of resistance against perceived political graft and unaccountable power.
It's becoming a global calling card for Gen Z dissent. Any other examples?
Our sources also mention similar digitally organized youth-led protests picking up steam in the Philippines, specifically targeting alleged corruption related to flood control infrastructure funds, again, linking government failure to tangible daily life impacts. The inspiration from Nepal's decentralized model was reportedly discussed explicitly in some of the online organizing forums there.
Okay, so the One Piece flag and decentralized digital tactics are spreading like wildfire, but you mentioned one more example, Georgia, which shows a different kind of connection, something perhaps even more significant.
Yes, the events in Tbilisi, Georgia, represent a fascinating evolution. Massive youth protests erupted there, demanding sweeping anti-corruption reforms, greater government transparency, and a stronger pro-European direction, pushing back against perceived democratic backsliding.
Standard demands, similar to the others. What was different?
The symbolism. While they understood the One Piece references, the striking thing reported by multiple sources was that large numbers of young Georgian protesters were seen waving the national flag of Nepal.
Nepal's flag? In Georgia, why on earth would they do that?
That's what's so profound. According to analysts and interviews with activists cited in our sources, it wasn't about cultural appropriation or just random symbolism. They were waving the Nepali flag because, in this new global context, Nepal itself had become a symbol.
A symbol of what?
A symbol of successful transition. It represented a concrete example, a recent, tangible case study of a nation where a youth-led, digitally organized movement had actually managed to overthrow a corrupt establishment and force a path towards genuine reform and accountability.
So waving the Nepali flag was like saying, they did it there against similar problems. We can do it here too.
Exactly. It transcended just borrowing a cool protest symbol like the Jolly Roger. It was leveraging the political legitimacy of Nepal's achievement. It was a direct message to their own government and to the world. We see the Nepali model, transparency, accountability, youth power, and we demand it here. It showed the movement was now sharing not just tactics and symbols, but also blueprints for political outcomes.
That shift from using a pop culture symbol to using another nation's flag as an emblem of successful change, that really underscores the digital spring idea. It's about interconnected learning and aspiration on a global scale.
It is. It highlights how quickly models for change can now circulate and inspire action far beyond their point of origin. The kids in Tbilisi weren't just mad. They had a recent relevant example of success to point to, thanks to Nepal.
This brings us to a crucial point. Revolutions often fizzle outright. They tear down the old regime, but then infighting starts, or there's no clear plan for what comes next, and things eventually revert or fall into chaos.
That's a very common historical pattern, unfortunately. The vacuum gets filled by the most organized, often not the most idealistic.
But Nepal seems different. You mentioned earlier this movement didn't just have anger. It had a plan, a detailed policy blueprint waiting in the wings. This is where the Kalkiism Research Center, KRC, comes in. Tell us about them. Who were these people?
The KRC is really the hidden engine behind the policy substance of the revolution. They weren't protesters on the streets. They were a think tank, a collective of about 50 leading Nepali economists, technologists, government specialists, maybe some legal minds, a diverse group of established experts.
And they'd been working on this for a while. This wasn't cooked up overnight during the protests.
Oh, no, for years. Our sources indicate the KRC had spent years meticulously developing a comprehensive, radical, and internally consistent policy framework for how Nepal could achieve sustainable development and eliminate corruption from within, using its own resources.
So basically an operational manual for a post-corruption Nepal was already written.
Pretty much. They had detailed macroeconomic models, governance proposals, technological frameworks, the works. They weren't just criticizing the old system. They had designed a complete alternative. And they had apparently been trying to get the government, even opposition parties, to listen for years.
And why didn't the old establishment listen if these were leading experts with a plausible plan?
Well, think about what the plan aimed to do. Eliminate systemic corruption and radically restructure the economy away from foreign dependence and elite capture. That's not exactly appealing if you're part of the elite benefiting from the status quo.
So direct threats to power and money.
Exactly. Sources point to three main reasons the KRC proposals were consistently ignored or dismissed. First, political risk. The core of the Kalkism plan involved radical transparency, which would inevitably expose and dismantle the entrenched patronage networks, the family ties, the party loyalties, the kickbacks that formed the real basis of political power for the established parties. Implementing it would be political suicide for them.
Okay, self-preservation. What else?
Second, economic inertia and ideological capture. The policymakers, the finance ministry officials, the central bankers. They were deeply embedded in the orthodox economic thinking promoted by international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The KRC's ideas like state-owned banks and zero-interest loans sounded like radical, untested heresy compared to the standard neoliberal playbook they were comfortable with.
So intellectual resistance, too. We don't do things that way.
Pretty much. And the third reason was the direct threat to vested private financial interests. Specifically, the powerful private banking sector, which allegedly had deep financial ties to the major political parties, stood to lose enormously under the KRC model of public banking. They would have lobbied hard against any such reforms.
So the KRC was ignored because their plan was too effective at challenging the status quo.
That seems to be the crux of it. But their years of work weren't wasted. They hadn't just written reports, they had also been doing outreach, training workshops, engaging with university students, building awareness of their ideas among the younger generation.
So when the revolution happened, Gen Z didn't just have vague demands for less corruption. They knew about Kalkism. They were demanding that specific plan.
That appears to be the case. The KRC had laid the intellectual groundwork. So when the breaking point came, the activists weren't just saying down with the government. They were implicitly and sometimes explicitly saying implement the KRC plan. It gave the movement a concrete, positive vision beyond just protest.
Okay, let's get into the substance of that plan. Kalkism. You said it has three main pillars, focusing on fundamentally changing how money works in the economy. What's the first pillar?
The first pillar is probably the most immediately striking and likely controversial: the transition to a fully cashless economy.
Completely cashless. No more paper money or coins at all.
That's the proposal. The core argument from the KRC is simple but profound. Systemic corruption thrives in the shadows, and physical cash provides the ultimate shadow. It's untraceable, anonymous. By eliminating physical currency and mandating that every single transaction, from huge government infrastructure contracts right down to buying vegetables at the local market, must be digital.
Then everything becomes traceable, auditable.
Exactly. Every transaction leaves a digital footprint. It creates a system of near-total financial transparency, making it incredibly difficult to hide bribes, elicit payments, or engage in tax evasion. The KRC had a slogan for it: from cash to code, from corruption to creation. The idea is that by moving finance onto transparent code, you eliminate the space for corruption and unlock resources for creation.
That's radical. The level of state surveillance that implies is immense. Wouldn't there be huge pushback on privacy grounds? Or just the practicalities in a country like Nepal, where not everyone might have reliable digital access?
Huge questions, absolutely. The KRC likely anticipated these. On privacy, their argument would probably be that the transparency is focused on flows of money to combat corruption, not necessarily individual spending habits scrutinized without cause, and that strong digital privacy laws would need to accompany the shift. On access, it's a massive infrastructure challenge. It would require ensuring universal, affordable access to digital payment systems, smartphones, reliable internet, a huge undertaking in itself, likely funded by the anticipated anti-corruption dividend. It's definitely the most technically and socially challenging pillar.
Okay, a huge challenge, but aimed squarely at the root habitat of corruption. What's the second pillar? It concerns the banks, right?
Yes, the second pillar is just as radical, state ownership of all banks.
All of them. Private banks cease to exist.
Under the KRC proposal, yes. All commercial banks would transition into being publicly owned institutions, operated digitally. This completely overturns the standard model of private finance driving the economy.
Why? What's the goal of state ownership?
It's about fundamentally redirecting the flow and purpose of capital. In a private banking system, the profits generated from lending, fees, and financial activities primarily flow to private shareholders, often concentrated wealth. Under the KRC model, since the banks are state-owned, those profits are returned directly to the state treasury.
To be used for public good.
That's the intention. The profits would directly fund public services, infrastructure, or reduce the need for other taxes. It also gives the state direct control over lending policies, aligning them with national development goals rather than just short-term private profit motives.
Okay, but hang on. State-owned banks have a terrible historical track record in many countries, don't they? Often plagued by inefficiency, political interference, lending to cronies, basically just replacing private corruption with public sector corruption. How does Kelkyism avoid that trap?
That's the million-dollar or maybe billion-dollar question. And it's a very valid concern based on historical experience. The KRC's counter-argument seems to rely heavily on the synergy with the first pillar, the cashless, transparent economy.
How so?
Because if all transactions within these state banks are digital and auditable in real time, it becomes much harder to hide politically motivated loans or siphon off funds secretly. The proposal mandates extreme transparency in the state bank's operations, loan allocation criteria, administrative costs, performance metrics, all subject to public oversight, potentially through independent watchdog bodies empowered by the new system. The digital nature is meant to be the antidote to traditional state sector opacity and cronyism.
So, technology and transparency as the safeguards against repeating past failures. It's a bold bet.
It's a very bold bet. It assumes you can engineer integrity through system design. It also fundamentally shifts the goal of banking from profit maximization to optimal resource allocation for national development, a completely different paradigm.
Okay, pillar 1, cashless economy. Pillar 2, state-owned banks. What's the third pillar? You mentioned zero interest.
Yes, the third pillar is arguably the most revolutionary from a purely economic theory perspective,
Right.
establishing zero interest rate economy.
Zero interest. How does that even work? Loans would be free.
Essentially, yes, for specific purposes. Since the banking sector is publicly owned and not driven by a profit motive, the state can afford to issue loans at 0% interest. The idea isn't just cheap money, it's eliminating the concept of usury or interest as a form of rent extracted from productive activity.
Who would get these 0% loans? Not just anyone for anything, surely.
No, the KRC model specifies these are targeted, primarily for productive investments, funding entrepreneurship, supporting smallholder farmers, financing crucial infrastructure projects, investing in education or green technology. The goal is to eliminate the crippling burden of debt, particularly compound interest, that often traps individuals, businesses, and even the state itself in cycles of repayment without necessarily fostering real growth.
It aims to unlock liquidity, make capital flow more freely into the real economy.
Precisely. It removes the cost of capital for essential domestic investment, ensuring that money invested stays productive within Nepal, rather than a significant chunk being siphoned off as interest payments, potentially flowing out of the country or back to concentrated financial interests.
But, every modern economy runs on interest rates. It's the fundamental tool for managing inflation, allocating capital risk. If money is free, wouldn't everyone just borrow endlessly? Wouldn't that lead to runaway inflation or massive malinvestment in speculative bubbles?
This is the major objection from mainstream economics, and the KRC needed a strong counter. Their argument seems to be threefold. First, the 0% loans are allocated, not a free-for-all. They are directed towards specific productive sectors aligned with national goals, job creation, green transition, food security, not for, say, unlimited consumer credit or real estate speculation. There'd still be credit assessment just based on project viability and social return, not ability to pay high interest.
So qualitative controls replace the price mechanism of interest rates.
In a way, yes. Second, they argue that the massive deflationary effect of eliminating systemic corruption and the existing burden of interest payments across the economy would largely counteract the potential inflationary pressure from increased liquidity. They believe the economy is currently so leaky due to corruption and debt servicing that plugging those leaks creates more fiscal space than the zero-rate policy consumes.
Okay, the anti-corruption dividend again.
Exactly. And third, they ground this partly in ethical or even historical arguments against usury, framing interest as an inherently parasitic drain on developing economies. They argue that for a nation trying to build from the ground up, prioritizing the use of capital over the rent of capital is essential.
It's a complete rethinking of finance. Cashless, state-owned, zero interest? It sounds almost utopian.
It's certainly radical, but the KRC presented it as a coherent, interconnected system. The transparency of the cashless pillar enables the accountability of the state banking pillar, which in turn enables the zero-interest pillar by ensuring funds are directed productively and profits return to the public. Each pillar reinforces the others.
And the payoff for taking these huge leaps. The KRC claimed this radical restructuring would generate enormous savings, right? The double whammy effect you called it.
Yes, that's the core promise. They argued that the combined savings from two main sources, first, eliminating systemic corruption, which some estimates put at draining 5–8% of Nepal's GDP annually, and second, eliminating the deadweight loss of interest payments throughout the economy would liberate a truly massive amount of capital.
Enough to fund.
What? Enough, according to KRC projections, to fully finance a comprehensive, high-quality, universal welfare state without raising taxes significantly or relying on foreign aid.
Fully funded. What kind of programs are we talking about?
We're talking free, high-quality education from primary school right through university for everyone. Universal comprehensive health care accessible to all citizens. Massive public investment in green infrastructure, renewable energy, sustainable transport, climate resilience projects. Essentially using the corruption dividend and the interest dividend to directly build human capital and a sustainable future.
So cleaning up the system directly pays for social uplift and green transition.
That's the central equation of Kalkiism. Controlling corruption isn't just a moral good. It becomes the primary engine of national development, potentially far more powerful than traditional GDP growth strategies that might still leak resources.
Beyond the economics, though, there was another major social reform embedded in the KRC blueprint, wasn't there? Something about gender equality.
Yes, and this is a really groundbreaking aspect that sets the KRC proposal apart globally. It tackled the issue of unpaid household labor.
Meaning housework, childcare, elder care, the work predominantly done by women, historically invisible in economic statistics.
Precisely that. The KRC plan proposed the formal institutional recognition of this unpaid care work as a legitimate and quantifiable economic contribution to the nation.
Recognition is one thing, but did it translate into anything tangible?
Yes, that's the revolutionary step. The proposal was that this recognized labor should entitle the caregiver, overwhelmingly women, to a direct state-backed income. It would also come with associated social protections, like contributions to pensions or access to benefits.
So paying people, mostly women, for the domestic work that societies rely on but have never valued economically.
Exactly. It's a direct attempt to use national economic policy to address centuries of gender inequality and economic insecurity for women. It would provide women with a degree of economic sovereignty and security, regardless of whether they also participate in the formal paid workforce, if Nepal actually implemented this.
It would be the first country in the world to do so on a national scale.
As far as our sources indicate, yes, it would be a landmark policy, fundamentally redefining what constitutes work and economic value within a society. It's a core part of the Kalkiism vision of a truly equitable and just economy.
So we have this incredibly detailed, radical policy blueprint from the KRC, but policy needs political will, it needs popular backing. This is where the energy of the Gen Z protesters comes back in. What was their core, non-negotiable demand that resonated with the KRC plan?
Beyond the general anger at corruption, their driving demand, the emotional heart of the movement, was the guarantee of meaningful work and a dignified future inside Nepal.
Healing that economy of absence we talked about.
Exactly. It was a direct rejection of the status quo, where the best hope for many was a visa to work abroad. There was this reported slogan that captured it. We don't want visas, we want value. Value our work, value our potential here at home.
They wanted to transform Nepal from being primarily an exporter of labor
Into a talent-retaining nation.
Right.
A place where young, educated, ambitious people could build fulfilling lives that contribute to their own country's development rather than fueling economies elsewhere. It was about reversing the brain drain and the heartbreak of separation.
And how did the KRC blueprint promise to deliver on that specific demand? How could it guarantee jobs?
The KRC framework didn't just see job creation as a desirable outcome. It framed a job guarantee as a fundamental right of citizenship, and the mechanism to deliver it was baked into the financial reforms.
How so? Through the state banks and zero interest.
Precisely. Because the zero-interest public banking system provides the state with massive low-cost liquidity specifically earmarked for national priorities, the government has the guaranteed financial firepower to invest heavily and consistently in public goods and domestic industries.
Like the infrastructure projects you mentioned.
Yes, building rapid transit systems, upgrading the digital infrastructure needed for the cashless economy, rolling out nationwide green energy projects, improving water and sanitation, maybe supporting local sustainable agriculture. All these things require significant labor. The KRC argued this state-directed investment, funded by the corruption-free financial system, would automatically generate large numbers of decent, meaningful jobs across various skill levels.
So it's not just waiting for private investment to hopefully trickle down. It's the state actively creating employment through necessary public works, funded by the reformed financial system.
That's the core idea. Replacing the despair and compulsion of migration with the dignity and opportunity of building your own country, it's a profoundly different vision of development.
The scale of this ambition, changing not just a government but the entire economic identity and social fabric of a nation, seemingly overnight it feels like more than just a regime change. Some of our sources draw parallels to huge historical turning points.
Yes, the comparison that comes up is the French Revolution. It's a deliberate, provocative parallel.
How does that comparison work?
Well, the argument goes like this. If the French Revolution of 1789 was the watershed moment that replaced the divine right of kings with the sovereignty of citizens and gave birth to the modern republic based on political equality,
Then the Nepali Revolution of 2025 is trying to achieve an equally fundamental break.
yes, but for the digital age, it seeks to replace the pervasive right of corruption and elite capture with the principle of digital integrity and radical transparency. It aims to replace dependence on foreign powers and remittances with genuine national economic sovereignty. And in doing so, it aspires to birth not just a republic, but the digital republic.
A digital republic. Meaning
Yeah.
what? A tech-enabled participatory democracy.
That seems to be the idea. A state where technology isn't just used for surveillance or efficiency, but as a tool for citizen engagement, for holding power accountable in real time, for ensuring resources are distributed equitably. They didn't storm a Bastille with pitchforks.
They flooded the government's servers with VPN traffic and its offices with protesters organized via Discord. They tore down firewalls, not castle walls.
Exactly. It's a revolution fought with different tools, aiming for a different kind of state, one built on transparency and code as much as on constitutions and laws.
Okay, let's bring this back to the global picture and that challenging idea you mentioned right at the start. How does this Nepalese experiment, this potential digital republic, act as the antidote to the anti-immigration wave that's so powerful in Western countries?
This is where the implications get really profound and potentially disruptive for global politics. The rise of anti-immigration sentiment and populist nationalism in many Western nations is largely fueled by an economic narrative, right?
The fear narrative. They're coming from poor countries to take our jobs, drain our resources, change our culture.
Exactly. It rests on the underlying assumption that people from developing nations must migrate for economic survival, that their own countries are inherently incapable of providing opportunities, thus creating pressure on wealthier nations.
And the KRC model, if it works in Nepal, directly challenges that core assumption.
It completely undermines it. If Nepal can demonstrate, and it's still a big if, of course, the implementation is key, but if they can demonstrate that a developing nation can achieve near full employment, rising living standards, and genuine economic dignity for its citizens domestically, through radical internal reforms focused on eliminating corruption and restructuring finance.
Then the whole premise of economic necessity driving mass migration starts to crumble.
Precisely. If this model proves viable and starts to be adopted by other nations in the global south, think about remittance-dependent economies in Central America or Southeast Asia like the Philippines or parts of Africa, Bangladesh. If those countries can create viable futures at home,
Then migration shifts from being a compulsion driven by desperation to being a choice made for personal reasons, like education or specific opportunities.
exactly. And that changes the entire moral and political calculus of the global migration debate. It removes the economic threat narrative that anti-immigration politicians rely on. It shifts the focus towards what could be called post-dependency economics.
post-dependency, meaning countries focusing on building self-sufficient, dignified economies at home rather than relying on exporting labor or receiving aid with strings attached.
Yes, it's about achieving genuine economic sovereignty. Nepal's ultimate ambition, if the KRC blueprint is followed through, is incredibly bold: to become the world's first truly post-corruption nation.
A nation where corruption isn't just reduced, but structurally eliminated by the system design.
That's the goal. And by doing that, they offer not just an economic model, but a powerful moral counter-narrative to the fear and scarcity politics dominating so much of the global discourse. By proving you can build dignity at home, they potentially alleviate the pressures that fuel migration crises and anti-immigrant backlash abroad.
It reframes the challenge. Instead of Western nations asking, how do we stop them from coming? The question becomes, how can we support conditions so people don't have to leave? Or even, what can we learn from their anti-corruption models?
It flips the script. It suggests that the solution to managing global migration might lie less in building walls and more in tackling the systemic corruption and economic inequality within all nations, both developing and developed. That's the profound challenge this Gen Z-led movement in Nepal has implicitly placed on the global agenda.
Reform your own internal structures, guarantee dignity for your own citizens wherever they are.
Or face the consequences. Because this generation, networked globally, now has access to both the organizational tools and potentially the radical policy blueprints to demand that change or try and build it themselves. #outro.
So wrapping up this deep dive, what happened in Nepal in September 2025 wasn't just a random protest that got lucky. Our sources paint a picture of a perfect storm, really.
Yeah, it seems like a convergence. You
Yeah.
have decades of accumulated structural problems, that deep economic precarity, the visible corruption, the painful reality of the economy of absence.
Colliding head-on with a digitally native generation that was not only fed up, but uniquely equipped to organize rapidly and effectively, bypassing traditional structures and state control.
And critically, unlike many past movements, they weren't just fueled by anger. They had access to a coherent, radical, and ready-made policy alternative waiting in the wings the Kalkiism blueprint developed over years by the KRC. That gave the movement direction and substance beyond just overthrowing the old guard.
It's a potent combination, and the takeaway seems clear. These kinds of youth-led, decentralized, digitally organized movements are not a fringe phenomenon anymore. They are arguably a major, perhaps the major, emerging force in global politics.
They've demonstrated they can achieve incredibly rapid political change, coordinating complex actions without traditional leadership, and they're capable of forcing genuinely radical policy ideas onto the national and potentially international agenda. They've mastered both the street protest and the digital network.
It makes you think about the big historical demands. The French Revolution fundamentally asked for political equality, citizenship. The Industrial Revolution drove demands for economic progress, workers' rights. What is the core demand of this moment, this digital spring originating in Nepal?
That's the final provocative thought our sources leave us with. If you boil down the Kalkiism project, the Gen Z demands, the pushback against forced migration, the fundamental question they're posing to the entire world, North and South, is this:
Go on.
what if genuine global prosperity means ensuring that no one must leave home simply to live a life of dignity? What if development isn't about some countries getting rich by extracting resources or labor from others, but about every nation building the capacity for its own people to thrive where they are?
That's a profound challenge to the way the global economy has worked for centuries.
It is, and that's the gauntlet that Nepal's Gen Z, armed with discord, anime flags, and radical economic theory, has thrown down to political establishments everywhere. The message seems to be: embrace transparency, tackle corruption at its roots, guarantee dignity at home, reform, or prepare to be replaced by those who will.